Thank you for being here and welcome to the, actually officially the last Idea Factory talk for of the first era, let's say, of Idea Factory. Idea Factory will restart fresher than ever from next September with a new spirit, let's say. So we are closing the academic year that was dedicated to walls, and so we want to thank the College of Art and Science and the Department of Humanities, Social Science and Communication, and the Teagle Foundation that very kindly offer economic assistance for this talk. So about the future of Idea Factory is becoming the official showcase of the CRE HHMI initiative. Many of you know that we do have a big initiative about allowing all students involved in enrolled in courses to be participating in original research. And this is a very important instrument for all the students to be involved in research when, because there is no pre-selection of students. Every student that is involved in a course is going to do original research. And from now on, the three organizers of the initiative will be three assistant professors from each one of the departments of the College of Art and Science. Dr. Vivian Cao from our Department of Humanities, Social Science, Communication, Dr. Mike Dabowski for the Department of Mathematical and Computer Science, and Dr. Alexandra Kuzmanov for the Department of Natural Science. But this is not the only news that we want to provide today. The other big news is that we are announcing a new series, which is a series that we, Paul and I, we really trust to be a very, very important initiative for all Lawrence Tech. And it's about humanity and technology, the world we make and what it means. So the world we make is technology, and the meaning of the things that we make is us, humans, that we provide a meaning to it. And we humanists, right, have a very crucial role to help the public and the technologists to understand what is the meaning of what the things that we technologists are doing, right? So it's a very important topic, and it's very timely in these times in which technology is really shaping our lives, and it's going to be more and more. So I'm actually sure that I see a lot of students here. That many of you are from technological majors. Can you raise your hand if you are, right? So you see that technology is actually shaping the way that we live, that we communicate with others. We spend our time, we navigate spaces. Our attention is hijacked by technology almost all the time. So it's very important dialogue that technology and humanity should have. And in seeking this dialogue, we are activating this new series with the support of the Michigan Humanities Council, support of Lawrence Tech, and also the Teagle Foundation. The program of the new series is 8 events per academic year in which nationally recognized experts and practitioners in both in humanities and technology, sometimes at the same time they are technologists and humanists, they collaborate to bring new knowledge in the interaction between technology and humanity. Also, it's very important. We want to be very much in relationship with a local institutions, and so we plan to collaborate with local high schools and the broader community here at Metro Detroit. So we do have already a schedule, and we are actually, these are the names of the four initial talks. In September, we will have Catherine Ailes. She's from Duke University, and she's a big expert in the relationship between technology and humanities. Also, in the role that that technology has in shaping the very identity of what we are. And she investigated topics like cybernetics and the concept of cyborg, and Paul knows much more about this.
Posthumanism, the concept of
Posthumanism.
And her most recent book is called Unthought, and it's on how cognition is distributed across technological networks, including like drone pilots or the power grid and things like that. Mm-hmm. So she has a lot of different possible things she could talk about. We haven't identified exactly her topic yet, but.
Right. In October, we will have a panel of different experts about Victor Frankenstein, which is the doctor that he created a monster that, in a way, is a piece of technology, if you want, right? And now it's a very ambitious panel that try to trace the relationship between what is possible now with biomedical engineering. What can we do with bodies nowadays, if we could, right? And we do have the perspective of a philosopher. We have a perspective of a scholar on Frankenstein, and the perspective of biomedical engineers. So they are going to fight about this, I believe. In November, we are going to have Sophia Bruckner, and she's a very multidisciplinary scholar, and she studied at MIT, and where she had this crazy idea of trying to create, to design the machines that were described in science fiction novels, which is a very interesting approach to creating new technology, right? And in December, we will have a neuroscientist that will talk about the development of the knowledge about the brain, and how the brain can be, in a way, simulated by artificial neural networks. So it's again, the relationship of we being humans and what we can do with technology in this very multidimensional dialogue between the two disciplines. And that's it. Very long presentation, I'm sorry. And I will give you the stage to Paul, that is going to introduce today's speaker. Thank you.
And in the spirit of humanity and technology, I will read our speaker's bio from my phone. So I'm really thrilled to have Dr. Aidan Beatty with us today. He is a historian and teacher from Ireland who holds a BA in History and Political Science from Trinity College Dublin, a master's in Modern Jewish History from the University of Chicago, and a PhD in International History also from the University of Chicago. Dr. Beatty's research focuses on Irish and British history, Jewish and Israeli history, masculinity, nationalism, race, and capitalism. His first book, Masculinity and Power in Irish Nationalism, won the American Conference for Irish Studies Best History Book Award, which is really remarkable for a first book. There are awards for first books. Very rarely are there awards for best books. Yeah, let's give him a round of applause for that. He is the co-editor of Irish Questions and Jewish Questions, Crossovers in Culture, coming out in August with Syracuse University Press, and I believe I saw pre-orderable on Amazon.
Yeah.
His work has been published in New Hibernia Review, the Journal of World Systems Research, ARA Ireland, the Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History, the Journal of Jewish Studies, and Israel Studies. He is currently writing a book on the gender, race, and intellectual history of private property in Britain, Ireland, and North America. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Aidan Beatty.
Thank you. this over. Okay, so I'm going to give a talk today that will kind of give an idea of some of the research I do. I know I have a lot of my own students here that I kind of forced to come to this. I'm very glad you're here, and I apologize that I did that to you. It'll also maybe give you an idea of the kinds of things that a humanities professor does with their time when they're not teaching. In other words, what they look forward to doing over the summer when their teaching load is much reduced. What I'm going to present is two separate research projects that I've kind of just very brutally mashed together, and hopefully it won't be so incoherent. Both papers are about travel and tourism and the politics of travel and tourism. So there is some kind of shared ideas here also about the ideas of Ireland as a set type of space that existed in the 19th century. And because I'm talking mainly about tourism, I'm going to start by talking about two tourists that came to Ireland in May 1856. One was a very obscure international industrialist, and the person traveling with him was his common-law Irish wife. They arrived in Ireland for a tour of the country, came first to Dublin, travelled westward to Galway, south to Limerick and Kerry, and then looped back up to Dublin and covered about 500 miles altogether. Writing to an old friend in London, this wealthy industrialist tourist described the bleak landscape that he passed through in Ireland. Post-famine Ireland was an island of ruins, some dating back to the early Middle Ages, some far more recent, or as he said, the land is an utter desert which nobody wants. Galway, my hometown, was an especially egregious example. He said it was covered with ruined peasant houses, most of which have only been deserted since 1846. There was a total absence of any industry at all across the island, and a mixture of what he called priests, lawyers, and assorted other parasites lived off the distress of the Irish peasants. The Celtic character of the population has gone to the dogs, he said. The level of policing was intrusive and shocking in what he called England's first colony. And this particular tourist said he had never seen so many police officers in any country, armed with carbines, bayonets, and handcuffs. In fact, he said, one can already notice here that the so-called liberty of English citizens is based on the oppression of the colonies. What little economic activity there was in Ireland was, he said, observable only in the richer pasture lands of Munster, which would be the southern province, and East Leinster over here. And additionally, he said that the locals, notwithstanding what he called their Irish fanaticism, were being made to feel increasingly unwelcome. By consistent oppression, he said, they have been artificially converted into an utterly impoverished nation, and now, as everyone knows, fulfill the function of supplying England, America, and Australia with prostitutes, casual labourers, pimps, pickpockets, swindlers, beggars, and other rabble. The tourist in question was a man named Frederick Engels. His common-law wife and travelling companion was Mary Burns, the older sister of Lizzie Burns, who would later be Frederick Engels' second common-law Irish wife. And the correspondent in London was this man, Karl Marx. And indeed, Engels ended his letter not only by discussing his own desire to write a history of Ireland, which he did do, although never finished it, but also a request that if his old socialist comrade would not visit and write about Ireland, Engels would have to do it himself. Frederick Engels had long had a fascination with the Irish, not least with regards to his two Irish wives. Echoing his observations about Irish migrants in his 1856 letter to Marx, Engels's more famous 1844 work, or 1845 I should say, The Condition of the Working Class in England, features a detailed discussion of the indigent population in Manchester's Little Ireland slum district. Placing Ireland's incorporation into the British industrial system into a broader historical frame, in this book Engels talked of how Limerick and Kerry, counties that he would later travel through, had been forcefully remade in a modern capitalist image. Hitherto a wilderness, he said, wholly without passable roads and serving by reason of its inaccessibility as the refuge of all criminals and the chief protection of the Celtic Irish nationality in the south of Ireland, it has now been cut through by public roads, and civilization, he said, has thus gained admission even to this savage region. The transition to capitalism for Ireland, therefore, was a process of civilizing Irish savages. Much of the rest of Engels's descriptions of Irish workers in conditions of the working class has a similarly deeply racialist tone. In quasi-ethnographic terms, Engels claimed that whenever a district in Manchester is distinguished for a special filth and a special ruinousness, the explorer, as he described himself, may chiefly count upon meeting those Celtic faces which one recognizes as different from the Saxon physiognomy. And Engels even wrote in surprise that I have occasionally heard the Irish Celtic language spoken in the most thickly populated parts of Manchester. With the talk of filth and drunkenness and a lack of cleanliness, which is the Irishman's second nature, Engels revealed his own biases along the way. The Irishman, he wrote in the singular, loves his pig as the Arab his horse, with the difference that he sells it when it is fat enough to kill. As the literary scholar Sari McDeasy has recently shown, the word Arab in early Victorian England was an often malleable and generally negative label, connoting racial as well as lower class barbarism. It suggested a civilizational inferiority. So it is clear where Engels was placing the Irish in a broader class-race hierarchy. The Irish, he said, were a people with a southern facile character little above the savage, and for work which requires long training or regular pertinacious application, the dissolute, unsteady, drunken Irishman is on too low a plane. They were too different and too backward to ever be properly assimilated into British life. Even if the Irish, who have forced their way into other occupations, should become more civilized, he said, enough of the old habits would cling to them to have a strong, degrading influence upon their English companions in toil, especially in view of the general effect of being surrounded by the Irish. But there was more going on here for Frederick Engels than just making kind of nasty, racialized slurs about Irish people. Engels believed that competition was the central motivating force in capitalism, what he called the completest expression of the battle of all against all which rules in modern civil society. He identified competition over wages as a defining issue for relations between civilized English workers and the savage Irish. The Englishman, he said, who is still somewhat civilized, needs more than the Irishman who goes in rags, eats potatoes, and sleeps in a pigsty. But that does not hinder the Irishman's competing with the Englishman and gradually forcing the rate of wages and with it the Englishman's level of civilization down to the Irishman's level. The Irish thus exerted downward pressure on the wages and civilized living standards of the English working class. They are yet another cause, he said, of abasement to which the English worker is exposed, a cause permanently active in forcing the whole class downwards. So in other words, as Engels goes through a whole load of these stereotypes, these very racial and very familiar Victorian stereotypes about the savage Irish, he was also thinking about certain problems to do with intra-class competition within the working class of the United Kingdom. His racialized discussion of the Irish was also a discussion of the problems of capitalism, specifically the problems of class competition and class consciousness. He claimed in this work that with the possible exception of the Irish, the degree of intelligence of the various workers is in direct proportion to their relation to manufacture. The factory hands, he said, are most enlightened as to their own interests. The miners somewhat less so, the agricultural labourers scarcely at all. Irish workers might work like factory hands, but they still have an agricultural class consciousness. Their agrarian origins make them a contradictory people, and Engels' views of the Irish bear comparison to his ambiguous depictions of pre-modern agrarian England. In some of the earlier sections of this book, Engels cast a somewhat harmonious gaze at the agrarian lives that he claimed existed in pre-capitalist England. Before the arrival of factories, he said that craft labour was built on patriarchal relations. Men worked from home in a quite different environment to the surveillance of the future capitalist workforce, and they had their wives and children as convenient helpers. Living conditions, he claimed, were superior to those that would come later for their urban proletarian successors. They did not need to overwork, he said. They did no more than they chose to do and yet earned what they needed. They had leisure for healthful work in garden or field, work which in itself was recreation for them. And they could take part besides in the recreation and games of their neighbours, and all these games, bowling, cricket, football, contributed to their physical health and vigour. They were, he said, for the most part strong, well-built people in whose physique little or no difference from that of their peasant neighbours was discoverable. Their children grew up in the fresh country air, and if they could help their parents at work, it was only occasionally, while of 8 or 12 hours work for them there was no question. So that's obviously quite harmonious, quite romantic, quite a nostalgic view of what life was like prior to industrial capitalism. But undermining these kinds of romantic visions of pastoral England, Engels also spoke of the rural craft labourers of pre-capitalist England as a people who vegetated through a passively comfortable existence. Intellectually, he said, they were dead, lived only for their petty private interest, for their looms and gardens, and knew nothing of the mighty movement which beyond their horizon was sweeping through mankind. They were comfortable in their silent vegetation, and but for the Industrial Revolution, they would never have emerged from this existence, which, cosily romantic as it was, he said, was nevertheless not worthy of human beings. In truth, they were not human beings, he concluded. They were merely toiling machines in the service of the few aristocrats who had guided history down to that time. The romantic notion that rural dwellers led an idyllic existence was a commonplace idea in Victorian Britain. And for Engels, certainly the social world of pre-capitalist England, of pre-capitalist times in general, was a mixture of a romantic and subtly gendered manly freedom and an uncivilized backwardness. For sure, the rapidity and dynamism of the new industrial time stood in marked contrast to what Engels and Marx would later call the idiocy of rural life. But conversely, the wholesome masculinity of that earlier time also stood in contrast to the oppressiveness of factory labour and the miseries of unemployed men that Engels now claimed were forced to do women's work. In many cases, the family is not wholly dissolved by the employment of the wife, he claimed, but turned upside down. The wife supports the family, the husband sits at home, tends the children, sweeps the room, and cooks. So therefore, he said, capitalism was an insane state of things. A new social world that, according to Engels, unsexes the man and takes from the woman all womanliness. The righteous and peaceful life in all piety and probity of pre-capitalist England, as he called it, had been replaced by the sexual exploitation of female workers and a factory servitude that he claimed confers the just prima noctis upon the master. In other words, factory owners now, according to Engels, have the right to have sex with their female employees. So for Engels, the transition from this idealized image of pastoral feudalism to industrial capitalism was accompanied by adverse shifts in gender roles. I think Engels saw the Irish as a living exemplar of this older social world of pre-capitalism. Where English workers had been irreparably changed by the industrial experience, Irish workers inhabited a contradictory existence. They lived and even worked within industrial capitalism, but maintained anachronistic social practices, ontologies, and epistemologies. Unlike English workers, the Irish remained unconscious of the power of socialized factory labour, but yet, for all their seemingly innate faults, the Irish also continued to exist outside of the coercive social discipline of capitalist modernity, and this held out some revolutionary possibilities. At a later point in the book, Engels discusses the latent discontent of industrial England and says, to this the Irish immigration further contributes by reason of the passionate mercurial Irish temperament which it imports into England and into the English working class. The mixing of the more facile, excitable, fiery Irish temperament with the stable, reasoning, persevering English must, he said, in the long run be productive only of good for both. Pre-capitalist and manly Irish communalism would mix productively with the dynamic power of the modern divisions of labour that English workers had supposedly learnt under capitalism. Around the same time that he wrote this book, Engels wrote a short article for a Swiss newspaper called The Swiss Republican. And in this article, he jealously eyed up this kind of Irish male agrarian muscularity and masculinity, as well as the famous nationalist monster meetings of Daniel O'Connell up here in the top hat on the top left corner of this image. O'Connell was the dominant nationalist figure in early 19th century Ireland. Here's how Engels described him and his monster meetings, as they were called. The wily old fox gets around from town to town, always surrounded by 200,000 men. a bodyguard such as no king can boast of. 2,000 men, and what kind of men? Men who have nothing to lose, 2/3 of them not even having a shirt to their backs. They are real proletarians and sans culottes, and moreover Irishmen, he said. Wild, headstrong, fanatical Gaels. If one has not seen the Irish, one does not know them. His final sentence was, give me 200,000 Irishmen and I could overthrow the entire British monarchy. There are a number of tropes in all of this, both in his serious work, The Conditions of the Working Class, and in his very bombastic claim about overthrowing the entire British monarchy. There are a number of tropes here that Engels shared with his comrade Marx. First, that the time of pre-capitalism was defined by both stagnancy and masculinity, vegetation and freedom. Pre-capitalist races not only continued to exist synchronically with capitalism, but they also continued to manifest signs of both racial stagnancy and decadence and romantic freedoms from a time before capitalism and before private property. And the Irish continued to be one of the most regularly employed examples for all of this. Ireland, as a kind of set-apart space in the global economy, was seen as a kind of laboratory by Marx and Engels in which they could understand the emergence of private property. And the Irish were seen as a potentially revolutionary force. Not only were they as yet unschooled in private property, they were also, in a sense, an unprivatized people. Marx and Engels' thinking on Ireland was of a piece with how they thought about some of the broader themes in their work, like race, masculinity, and the times of capitalist development. In her well-known book, City of Dreadful Delight, Judith Wolkowitz has placed Engels' urban writings in the context of what she calls the throng of missionaries and explorers, men who tried to read the illegible cities of industrial revolution Britain, men such as Charles Dickens or Henry Mayhew, who wrote about the lives and work and living conditions of poor people in the major cities of Britain. And Engels' rural writings were part also of a tradition that existed in Victorian Britain. His short 1856 account of what it was like to visit Ireland is perhaps best understood in the broader context of Victorian-era travel literature, in which, again, mainly male visitors interpreted the exotic experiences of Ireland for readers on the other side of the Irish Sea. To travel to Ireland was allegedly a way to experience a primitive Gaelic space that has somehow survived from another time, where even the local residents were perceived in the tourist's gaze as being part of the curious natural scenery. There was also a supposed therapeutic quality to experiencing Ireland directly. As one historian said, coming from an increasingly urban industrial society, some tourists wanted to imagine the Irish peasantry as untouched and unspoiled by materialism, leading simple lives untrammeled by modern complexities, pressures and discontents. And yet at the same time, the sense that something was wrong with Ireland permeated many travel narratives from this period, especially in the period immediately before and after the famine of the 1840s. Engels worked through all of these tropes, ploughed all of these furrows in his travelogue and in his writings on Ireland in general, albeit in a very anti-capitalist direction rather than in a more conservative one. And Marx, I think, also understood Ireland in this way. In the first volume of Das Kapital, in the context of his discussion of what he called the general laws of capitalist accumulation, Marx engaged in a focused discussion of Ireland, the only non-English region analysed at systematic length in his monumental work. We must travel for a moment to Ireland, he tells his readers. And throughout his discussion, Marx is very keen to delineate between England, which he calls an industrial country, and Ireland, an agricultural country, a distinction that's not just socio-economic, but also temporal. England resides within the space-time of modern industrial capitalism. Ireland has not yet made the full transition, according to Marx, from the time of feudalism. In Ireland, social relations supposedly still bear the trace of the pre-capitalist, and Marx lamented the eradication of harmonious and traditional pre-capitalist social forms that he claimed had been in existence in Ireland from time immemorial. The first act of the Industrial Revolution in Ireland, he said, was to sweep away the huts situated on the field of labour, This was done on the largest scale and as if in obedience to a command from on high. Thus, many Irish labourers, were compelled to seek shelter in villages and towns. They were thrown like refuse into garrets, holes, cellars and corners in the worst back slums. Thousands of Irish families, Marx said, who are notable for their rare attachment to their domestic hearth, for the gaiety and the purity of their home life, found themselves suddenly transported into hotbeds of vice. So for Marx, the transition to capitalism was a transition away from Irish gaiety and purity into a world of English urban vice. In Das Kapital, Marx approvingly noted the Irish warmth with which early trade unionists in Ireland organised their meetings, a warmth that was presumably born out of the country's lingering pre-capitalist traits. In Marxist terms, the pre-capitalist base of Ireland determined the superstructural warmth of the country's inhabitants. Whatever dynamism capitalism was bringing to the country, it also meant that the bucolic warmth of the Irish people would be lost forever, and Marx's thoughts on the nature of Irish society were a development of his thoughts on pre-capitalist societies more broadly. Already in the 1840s, Marx was talking about what he called the abstraction of private life, by which I think he meant the remaking of our sense of selfhood from a feudal self to the privatized sense of self under capitalism. He talked about the Middle Ages as being the animal history of mankind, the time when people lived a primitive but non-alienated life. In his roughly contemporaneous 1844 manuscripts, Marx said that the goal of capitalism was the unhappiness of society. Capitalism, he says, degrades each worker to a beast reduced to the strictest bodily needs. It is a system that perfects the worker and degrades the man. And production, he said, does not simply produce man as a commodity, the human commodity, man in the role of commodity, but he says it produces him in keeping with this role as a mentally and physically dehumanized being. The true meaning of the Irish for Marx was that they continued to exist outside of this unhappy capitalist dehumanization. They were still a warm and more fully human people, exemplars of a kind of feudal earthiness. They embodied the human, intimate ontology of feudalism. They were what Marx elsewhere called real corporeal man, man with his feet firmly on the solid ground, man exhaling and inhaling all the forces of nature. Even the environment of Ireland itself seemed more conducive to a natural life. In his unfinished History of Ireland, Engels claimed that the weather, like the inhabitants in Ireland, has a more acute character. It moves in sharper, more sudden contrasts. The sky is like an Irish woman's face. Here also rain and sunshine, he said, succeed each other suddenly and unexpectedly, and there is none of the grey English boredom. Both Marx and Engels employed Victorian stereotypes here about the warm and lovable, supposedly pre-modern Irish. Irish indeterminacy, the idea, the sense that this nation defied categorization, was certainly a familiar Victorian concern. As one historian has said, the Irish were national subjects incorporated into the British nation state through parliamentary and economic structures, but they remained a colonized and alien population, denied fundamental rights of citizenship and subjecthood, and constructed as culturally, religiously, and racially other. This position rendered the Irish within the newly created United Kingdom vexatious in relation to questions of national belonging. Another historian has said that the Irish were seen in Victorian Britain as an ambivalent people who defied any easy visual coding, just as Marx and Engels saw them as both feudal at home but industrial capitalist in England. The notion that there was something different about the Irish and that this difference was somehow connected to Irish people's supposedly anomalous relationship with private property was another commonplace idea of Victorian Britain. For Victorian elites, the instability of post-famine Irish society was the result of a society where there were too many indigent tenant farmers and not enough responsible owners of private property. Marx and Engels rehearsed and borrowed from a number of these conventional racial stereotypes about the wild and primitive Irish who supposedly had a lack of internalized respect for private property. But they also used these racialist ideas in a malleable and strategic manner. One of the most central ideas in all of Marx's work, and in all of the work inspired by Marx that's usually lumped together under the term Marxism, is the idea of historical determinism. Most famously stated by Marx in this work, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, where he said, "Men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. Rather," he said, "the tradition of all the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living." And it seems to me that the veracity of this idea is perhaps best shown by the fact that Marx himself was trapped in the spatial and racial concepts and vocabulary of the Victorian world in which he worked, as much as he could also critically deploy these concepts. 70 years after the publication of this book, it seems almost as if Marx got channeled back into Ireland once more when Stephen Dedalus and/or James Joyce famously declared in Ulysses that history is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake. Ulysses, as some people here might know, was set in a single day on the 16th to the 17th of June 1904 at the tail end of what's usually called the Irish Revival or the Gaelic Revival. The high culture exponents of this movement are quite well known internationally, people like W.B. Yeats or J.M. Synge or Augusta Gregory. But in parallel to the work of Yeats and company, this was also a moment of nationalist, perhaps less sophisticated cultural production, much of it focused on the construction of a de-Anglicized, Gaelic-speaking culture, and often operating through an organisation called the Gaelic League. And I'm going to focus on this organisation quite a bit, the Gaelic League, for the rest of my talk. Just as Yeats or Synge often focused on an idealised vision of rural Ireland in works like Synge's The Aran Islands or Yeats's The Lake Isle of Innisfree, so also groups like the Gaelic League constructed an idealised vision of the rural spaces of Ireland. The League was founded in 1893, influenced by the publication of this essay, The Necessity for De-Anglicising Ireland, by Douglas Hyde, a professor of the Irish language at University College Dublin. Hyde went on to be the first president of the Gaelic League and also later the first president of Ireland. The image used in the poster for this talk is from Seachtain na Gaeilge, or Irish Language Week, in 1913. This was the Gaelic League's largest annual event, usually held in Dublin. The poster was designed by a woman called Seska Senovich Trench, or Sive Trinchach, as she changed her name to when she kind of converted to Irish language activism, even though she initially came from a very English background. Her brother Dermot Trench was the inspiration for a man named Haynes, an obnoxious English character in Joyce's Ulysses. What I'm particularly interested in this image is the way in which the poster offers two starkly different images of the spaces of Ireland. On the right is the image of a pathetic and humiliated personification of Ireland, literally draped in a Union Jack in a British flag, while on the left, not begging for charity, but standing upright, strong and proud, is a very dignified and strong image of Ireland. The departing immigrants, depicted here in tiny boats on the right, have now been replaced with ships that are held back by ropes by this character, which itself suggests a certain kind of rootedness and stability. The two other differences that we can see in these images are spatial and linguistic. The right-hand image is of a fully Anglicised Ireland, one that is no longer even really Ireland, it's just West Britain. The image on the left is of more purified era, the Irish for Ireland, but also notice the spatial, a certain spatial distinction here where West Britain is a kind of reduced version of Ireland where certain key sections have been cut off. Significantly, it's the western seaboard, the western coast of Ireland, the last places where Gaelic was still the main vernacular language. What the image is trying to say is that national spatial unity and linguistic unity are one and the same. The Gaelic League's founding in 1893 coincided with two important developments, one spatial, one linguistic. The 1891 census had revealed that the numbers of monoglot Gaelic speakers had dropped to just 1% of the total population of Ireland, meaning that from the perspective of Irish cultural nationalists, the last remnant of a purely Gaelic-speaking Irish culture, one that had not directly experienced Anglicisation, was on the verge of extinction. These Irish speakers were almost exclusively to be found in remote regions along the western coast, regions that are collectively called the Gaeltacht, literally meaning the Irishness, as opposed to the Gaeltacht, the foreignness, the parts of Ireland where English was the predominant language. And second, from the 1890s onwards, new train lines were being built that now connected these remote Gaeltacht regions to the rest of Ireland. And these two processes are obviously linked. Economic and cultural integration into the rest of the country, and through that into the rest of the world, undermine the use of a language that only a handful of people outside the Gaeltacht could speak to any degree of proficiency. And what I'm quite interested in is how the Gaelic League was a product of all of these changes. Members of the Gaelic League could now travel to the Gaeltacht and experience directly the supposedly pre-modern Gaelic culture of the region's inhabitants. This kind of nationalist tourism was a central part of the Gaelic League's activities, a way for the organisation's members to take trips to the Gaeltacht, directly experience a supposedly more authentic Irish culture that existed there, and then return to major cities like Dublin, supposedly rejuvenated in their authentic Irishness. In May 1803, a decade into its existence, the Gaelic League organised one such trip for its members from Dublin to Galway, described here as Túras go Galway, so tour to Galway City, or to County Galway. In the brochure produced for those taking part, depicted here, precise instructions were given for how Gaelic League members should experience the Irish space that they would pass through. As you can see in the second page here, it says, as you come to the different train stations mentioned in this series of notes, fix their Irish names and their meanings in your memory, and use the Irish names in future always when referring to these places. So it goes through a number of different places that you would pass on the train from Dublin to Galway. Clúnsailach, or Clonsilla in English, the meadow of the Sallies, not far from which is Cnucka or Castleknock, where Fionn McCool's father was killed, a figure from Irish nationalist mythology. From him, it claims, Cool is named Rathcoole a few miles away. And there's a very clear didactic kind of educational quality to all of this. Gaelic League day trippers were being taught about Ireland and instructed in how to feel rooted in its past, present and future, and how to feel rooted in the spaces of Ireland. Using Irish names always rather than their anglicised versions was also a way to express Irish ownership over these spaces. It was pitched as a way to undo both Anglicisation and the British spatial control of Ireland. But it's quite telling that it's only in the description of Irish-speaking Galway, on this page here, that there are actual living people depicted in these notes, in this brochure. As it describes it here in a somewhat exotic light, as you cross the River Corrib in the town of Galway, you will come to Salthill. Leaving the tram line at the left corner of Lower Dominic Street, you arrive at the Claddagh, the village of fishermen, who it says are rather conservative in habits and manner, but who use Gaelic as their ordinary speech. The Yiddish language scholar Benjamin Hershav has said of the representation of the shtetl, this kind of Yiddish-speaking town of Eastern Europe in modern Yiddish literature, that the shtetl was unmistakably reconstructed from a distance. Both the writer and his readers are already modern city dwellers who believe in culture, progress and civilization, and look back at the small town as at a museum exhibit. And I often feel there's something similar going on here about urban-based tourists going to a rural space, romanticizing it and valorizing it, but also feeling that their own sense of modern identity is reinforced as they do that. The residents of the Gaeltacht, predominantly poor farmers and fishermen, speaking a language previously maligned as backwards, were now praised as the living repositories of a recovered Gaelic heroism. As the notes for the 1903 tour make clear, Gaelic League tourists from Dublin were urged to feel connected both to the ancient masculine heroism of characters like Fionn McCool, one of the most archetypal figures from Irish mythology, as well as the museum exhibits of the Irish-speaking, Gaelic-speaking periphery. Experiencing both was a means to re-strengthen and re-masculinize the Irish nation. And indeed, the brochure ends here with the statement in Irish, in Gaelic, Gunneartig dia sin agus go sirmish era. May God strengthen us and we will free Ireland. What often seems to be at stake for the Gaelic League was the idea that the memory of Ireland's ancient manly heroism was embedded in certain spaces of Ireland. Travelling to these spaces, reconnecting to them, was a means of reconnecting to embedded memories, memories embedded supposedly in these spaces, and would thus ultimately allow for a reconnection with ancient heroic Irish masculinity. Moreover, by moving through these spaces, by demanding that Irish rather than English names be used, the predominantly male urban leadership of the Gaelic League could demonstrate their ownership of Ireland. Taking control of this space would allow Irish nationalists, a predominantly urban group, to reconnect with the Gaeltacht, an isolated rural space that was imagined as being free of the humiliating presence of an effeminizing British cultural colonialism. As Douglas Hyde declared in 1914, the Gaelic League was building up a little Irish nation which would become big someday. He hoped, please God, so big as to absorb the entire island. Nationalist ideology like this often operates according to an institutionalized tie between nationhood and statehood. And the modern state, as the French scholar Henri Lefebvre describes it, is a spatial framework of power. Intentionally or not, by imagining Ireland as spatially distinct and with the Gaeltacht as the symbolic heart of that spatial imaginary, Gaelic Leaguers like Douglas Hyde were nourishing a kind of separatist politics. Considerations of space permeated the work of the Gaelic League as they did with much of contemporary Irish nationalism. And borrowing from the terminology of the geographer Neil Smith, Irish nationalism was an attempt to move from relative space, which is to say Ireland's status as an internal part of the United Kingdom, to absolute space, a separate and spatially coherent nation state. In addition, the spaces of Ireland had undergone a number of profound changes in the decades prior to the emergence of the Gaelic League. From the famine onwards, Ireland became more and more integrated into the spaces of a British-centric global trading system. Large-scale train transport served to unify Ireland into one coherent space for the first time. One prominent Irish historian has even gone so far as to speak of a transport revolution in the second half of the 19th century, and to argue that along with emigration and the national schools, the railways might well be seen as yet another factor which contributed to the weakening of those social and economic conditions which had helped to preserve old traditions and cultural patterns in rural Irish society. As I mentioned, there was an interesting congruence between the founding of the Gaelic League in 1893 and the opening of the Galway to Connemara railway line, which would be the area up here, in 1895. These kinds of regions now became accessible for the first time to Anglophone tourists. As one historian has said, railways allowed ordinary people to travel for recreation for the first time, and cultural nationalists in Ireland were now able to combine summer vacations by the sea with opportunities to hear the Gaelic language spoken fluently and to improve their own grasp of the language and its supposedly unique oral culture. Indeed, by the time of the Gaelic League's day trip to Galway in 1903, the Midland and Great Western Railway was operating a tourist express service to North Connemara, which left Dublin at 3 p.m. and would arrive, left Dublin at noon and would arrive in Connemara by 5 p.m. This construction of rail transport, the shortening of travel times, the growing sense of an imagined community all living in a shared space, all this fed into a consciousness of a shared modern Irish identity. The focus on recovering a mythic past was also a means of negotiating this rapid transformation toward modernity and the unsettling sense that in capitalist modernity, as Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels once said, all that is solid melts into air. The building of railways and the new spatial regime which they engendered were key elements of the experience of a British capitalist modernity in late 19th century Ireland. Railways opened up Ireland further as a market for British goods, and as elsewhere in the empire, railways eliminated spatial barriers to circulation and production by opening up new sources for raw materials and markets for British manufacturers. And colonial spatial economy structuring was distinguished by its privileging of infrastructures of circulation over production. The new spatial regime of capitalism and Ireland's dependent economic status within that regime were experienced simultaneously. The nationalist emphasis on Irish spatial distinctness was a response to both. These changes in rail infrastructure also created a new awareness of this space of the Gaeltacht as a distinct space. The Irish-speaking western seaboard, previously isolated from the English-speaking and more urbanized East Coast, was now in the process of being discovered by the Gaelic League. The Gaeltacht was being created as an accessible space, even as the Anglicisation that came in the wake of that creation irreparably changed it. In addition, the Gaeltacht's residents were valorised as the newly discovered ancient repositories of Irish-speaking culture. The word Gaeltacht was not in fact used commonly until the late 19th century, and the Irish language scholar Caitríona O'Torna has even gone so far as to suggest that some conscious strategies lay behind the construction of this overtly spatial term. As she says, translated into English, the inspiration and aim of the Gaeltacht construct was to entice the Irish people into an esteem for their hereditary language and for those who spoke it, something that would foster national identity. It is clear from the talk of revivalists, like Irish language revivalists from Dublin, that they themselves imagined the Gaeltacht as a well of Irish heritage, as a receptacle of virtue. And there seems to be an obvious utopianism and idealized depiction of the world to this invention. One of the few women to take a leading role in the Gaelic League, born Agnes O'Farrelly but changed her name to Una ní Haralig, was certainly a kind of middle-class utopianist, as her biographer Rina Nakungal has recently observed. The Irish-speaking Aran Islands off the western coast of Connemara had a central role for ní Haralig's utopianism. According to Rina Nakungal, this was not unlike the role that America played for socialist thinkers like Robert Owen. For her, however, it was a place that avoided the dystopian capitalism of the United States. The Aran Islands were seen by ní Haralig as pristine places free of the polluting impact of English and Anglicisation. Ní Haralig would later recall that visiting the Aran Islands for the first time was like entering a foreign land. She said she was a foreigner in this space, yet she said it was the only space in which one could properly understand how to be essentially Irish. And these were common views of the Gaeltacht, of a newly discovered, almost foreign space onto which urban Gaelic Leaguers could project their visions of a future decolonised Ireland. And indeed, commenting on the increasing use of the word Gaeltacht in the late 19th century, Caitríona O'Torna discusses how it was constructed in opposition to its mirror image, the Gaeltacht, the Anglophone parts of Ireland. A report in one 1907 issue of the Gaelic League's newspaper on Clive Sullish, the Sword of Light, described the feeling of leaving the industrial spaces of a dystopian Gaeltacht and entering the utopian and presumably non-capitalist Gaeltacht. As this writer said on Clive Sullish, "Behind me I was leaving Anglicisation with all its hideousness and soulless materialism, its big smoking chimneys and prison-like factories called commercial prosperity, where thousands of Irish men and Irish women, in their struggle for a sordid existence, forget they have a soul. Before me lay the Gaeltacht, where the spiritual, passionate Gael, like the Gaelic speaker, with his simple, beautiful customs, speaking his own language and singing his own sweet songs, lived as God intended that he should. As well as setting up a dichotomy of a clean, idealised Gaeltacht versus a diseased, Anglophone and industrialised Gaeltacht, the article also suggests that the Gaeltacht is a place where men seem to be dominant. The Gael, the native Gaelic speaker, is spoken of here in overtly masculine terms, as if the space he inhabits is the sole preserve of free and happy men, where the destructive and effeminizing impact of British politics and economics is noticeable by its absence. A young militant nationalist named Desmond Ryan, travelling through the Gaeltacht with his school teacher Pádraig Pearse in 1915, similarly saw something of great national value in this space. The quaint native dress, he said, the courtesy, the speech, the manners, all showed something inherently strong, wholesome and virile. Something which has survived many vicissitudes, shall more and in its own sure time grow into the larger, sweeter and more beautiful country of our dreams, he claimed. There's a trace of exoticism to how Desmond Ryan saw the Gaeltacht, and yet for Ryan, even if this was a dream, it was still, he said, the real Ireland, an Ireland of wholesome and virile men. Catriona O'Torna has gone so far as to suggest that there's a taste of the anthropologist even in a January 1903 account in Enclive Sulish of a trip to North Connemara. Only on the lonelier mountain slopes of Connemara, the account says, does one find the Ipasimus Gael, the Gael as he was in the days when Granuail's warships swept these seas and the clans that garrisoned these mountains were wont periodically to sweep down on the burghers of Galway and Athenry, two English-speaking towns. I met him last week, met strong men and women in the prime of life whose Irish organs of speech have never been defiled by a word of English. There is some staying power in the race after all, the account ended. The use of the Latin term ipasimus, which I had to look up online when I first saw it, meaning the very essence of something, suggests that the Irish speakers of North Connemara were the purest essence of a racially defined Irishness and still in touch with a kind of Irish heroism from the age of people like Granuail, a character from 16th century Irish history. O'Torna has foregrounded how this sense of a pure Irish space freed from the pollution of Anglicisation was linked to a sense of a time that was also freed from English control, a phenomena that she aptly labels in Irish, here in am, here sa Gaeltacht, back in time, back to the Gaeltacht. So in other words, moving backwards in language, in space, in time, they all become one in the imagination of people involved with the Gaelic League. For all their claims of recovering an ancient Irish language, an ancient Irish essence, and an ancient Irish space-time, there were still some remarkably English elements at work here. Valorizing the life of rural peoples was a common trope in 19th century British culture, as the scholar Elizabeth Helsinger has observed in this book. Bucolic depictions of rural scenes evoked a sense of post-industrial loss and also served as a social glue for an increasingly class-divided capitalist society. As Helsinger has said, when the imagery of rural land and life signifies the nation in 19th century Britain, it makes both descriptive and symbolic claims that rural life in geographically English spaces is, or has been, or should be like this, and that rural England can represent all of Britain. The rural place described, she said, is a part of England that is made to stand for the whole nation against the competing claims of other contemporary images such as the city or the machine. The relation is metaphoric. The rural scene represents something characteristic of, presumably, all geographic and social parts of the whole, some qualities that are essentially English and thus, it is assumed, essentially British. As Helsinger points out, though, this is a rural life that is increasingly distant from the everyday experiences of British or English subjects. This transfer of meaning, she says, often brings with it a certain stylization. Images and narratives are simplified and codified as they are staged, performed, and quoted for a national audience. And it seems to me that Gaelic Leaguers were clearly operating within these broader traditions of pastoral romance, idealising peasant peoples and holding them up as symbols of the nation, whilst continuing in the main to live in urban, capitalist, Anglophone Dublin. The romantic depictions in the early 20th century of the Gaelic west of Ireland seem almost like a repackaging of a similar set of romantic depictions of Gaelic Scotland in the 18th century. As one famous tourist to the Scottish Highlands and Isles said in 1773, Dr. Johnson had for many years given me hopes that we should go together and visit the Hebrides, that we might there contemplate a system of life almost totally different from what we had been accustomed to see, and to find simplicity and wildness and all the circumstances of remote time or place so near to our great land. Boswell's depiction that I've just been quoting seems like it could almost just be translated straight into the work of the Gaelic League. As I argued at the start of this paper, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were also invested in these kinds of somewhat romantic depictions of the rural and supposedly pre-modern, pre-capitalist spaces of Britain and Ireland. Marx regularly compared what he saw as the end of feudalism in Ireland, for example, to its Gaelic cousin in what he termed the promised land of modern romance, the Highlands of Scotland, where once independent peasants were systematically dispossessed, such that, Marx said, the remnant of the Aborigines were removed from their lands and flung on the seashore. But Marx and Engels also had an ability to critically deploy such tropes in their writings. Visiting Ireland for a second time in September 1869 with his second wife Lizzie Burns and with Marx's daughter Eleanor Marx, Friedrich Engels saw some important changes in the country. While some parts of Ireland still remained downright depopulated, he said Dublin was now unrecognisable. Trade was at a high level at the port, and the city had acquired a newly cosmopolitan air. And all of this pointed to a regrettable conclusion for Friedrich Engels. The worst about the Irish, he said, is that they become corruptible as soon as they stop being peasants and turn bourgeois. In other words, as they stop being feudal and become capitalist. True, he said, that is the case with most peasant nations, but in Ireland it is particularly bad. So it would seem that from the point of view of Engels and Marx, the space of Ireland had made the leap from feudalism to capitalism. And in what was probably his last ever public comment on Irish affairs, Engels used an interview in 1888 with the New Yorker Volkszeitung, the New Yorker people's newspaper, a socialist workers' newspaper, to confess that, as he said, a purely socialist movement cannot be expected in Ireland for a considerable time. People there, he complained, want first of all to become peasants owning a plot of land, and after they have achieved that, he concluded, mortgages will appear on the scene and they will be ruined once more. Bringing his career as an erstwhile Irish studies scholar to an end, Friedrich Engels looked into the bleak capitalist future with an intriguing prophecy. Before any socialist revolution can take root in Ireland, the country will first have to be ruined by a mortgage-based crisis of financial capitalism. Thank you.
About 10 minutes to questions.
Questions?
I'll go if none of the students might ask a question. So you reminded me how much of the conditions of the English working class is about their bad sex lives.
Yeah.
Due to malnutrition and no sleep and everything. But what it makes me think of is Family and the Origins of Private Property. Mm-hmm. And how I'm trying to recall that text, how much of that text is devoted to Native American cultures.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested about I can't remember what it is, the commentary. So the Native Americans are a dilemma for Jefferson and others.
Yeah.
Because they seem to be natural and pre-modern.
Yeah.
And yet they don't have vero machismo, male
No.
models. The men lay around and the women do all the work.
Yeah.
At least that's a recurring commentary from Jefferson and other early Americans. So I'm just wondering about that contrast. Here he's looking at the Irish.
Yeah.
And he's thinking about a primitive machismo masculinity.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what the comparison is to Native Americans, their primitiveness, but the lack of what a European would recognize as machismo or male dominance.
Well, in general, Engels kind of shifts by the time he writes Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State. He's not as kind of, I mean, is that
a later work? I'm not.
It's maybe 1880s, maybe even 1890s. To kind of make any undergraduate feel really insecure, he wrote Conditions of the Working Class when he was 24.
I remember that, yeah.
Whilst living with his parents. And his father was Engels came from a very pietist background, and you can really see that he still kind of has some lingering, like, ultra-conservative ideas about human sexuality. And says on one hand, we shouldn't judge these people. They have miserable lives. They work 14 hours a day. Of course, they all, come straight out of the factory and get blind drunk on the streets. he says that about the English workers, but then is very condemnatory of the Irish workers for doing the exact same thing, and says it's terrible that they all have sex on the streets and stuff like this. He does mention Ireland or sort of Celtic peoples quite a bit in Origins of the Family, where he still has this sense of like this is kind of like the original Ireland that you can still kind of find traces of.
But there's this strong, as I'm recalling, it's been 25 years since I've read these books, there's this strong kind of call to the working class, quit the factories, go back to the farm, and you can lay around and have sex all day with your wife. And it's awesome.
Yeah.
A primitive agrarian existence is great because you just spend all your time having sex. And I'm wondering about what the reflection is on Native American culture. And there's an image of masculinity, right? The dominance of the woman is an expression of your power. But that's not at all a 19th century vision of Native American culture.
So the broader, I mean, I've kind of cut out a lot to make these two papers fit, but the broader thing I'm really interested in with Marx and Engels is both of them have this thing of looking at different parts of the world and saying there are places in the world where private property doesn't exist. There's only two places where they're kind of positive about this. One is Ireland, the other is Russia.
Oh, okay.
And Marx will say like, you'll find these kind of little hints of their things which you can, if you spend far too much of your time going through all 65 volumes of their collected works, you'll find enough to kind of construct, this is what Engels and Marx thought of China, of India, of African Americans and of Native Americans. And they tend to just accept certain kinds of racial stereotypes. And then try to explain it through.
So the notion is that Native Americans are not virile in their essential natures.
They say the exact same about.
To a primitive state would not necessarily bring that out, or something that would be repressed in them by.
I mean, Marx said that like South Asians are an utterly effeminate people, and they're always going to be conquered by someone. So it might as well just be the British.
So what the capitalist turn does is crush whatever your natural spirit is, but there's not a universal category of what naturalness is.
They do seem to kind of accept this idea of really severe racial distinctions between certain peoples. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Which is a huge tension with the quote you had about historical materialism, right? There's this idea.
Yes. And this is a complete contradiction.
Well, yeah, and it's a tension. When you can see, what's interesting is that you can see the evolution in Marx from the manuscripts of 1844, which are profoundly kind of humanistic, right? To the late capital, right? And, so I think it's a productive tension. What you bring up here. My question has to do with. I actually think these two papers work really well together. The kind of hybridization because the continuous trope from a literary scholar's perspective is the pastoral, right? Pastoral is a very old genre that goes all the way back to the ancient world, where you basically have urban people reflecting on how great it is to be in the country. Right? What is different, though, and I would like to hear you comment about, is Marx and Engels seem invested in more abstract categories, such as feudal labor or historical processes. Whereas it seems that the Gaelic League is very invested in very specific Irish nationalist categorization. So I'm wondering if you could just reflect a little bit further on like the differences between those two kinds of, if you're going back to Ireland for a model of what you see as world historical processes, or if you're going back to Ireland for a model of a kind of essentialist identity.
Yeah. I mean, I think, so Marx has this thing called primitive accumulation, right, of how does public land become private? And he does seem to think that this is actually happening in his time in Ireland, and you can kind of see it happening right now. And he's completely wrong, it's not. He sort of completely ignores a whole load of really difficult problems about Ireland. Engels, in the letter I said, that I quoted at the very start, says there's no economic activity whatsoever going on anywhere in the island except, he says, in like farmland down here, and there's some like early industrialization here. This entire area is massively industrialized, and they just completely ignore it and say this is a rural island. England is an industrialized island, or Britain is an industrialized island, and they kind of understand them as binary oppositions. And I think the way I try to explain my way out of this is to say he's not a historian. He doesn't care in these kind of messy problems about there is actually serious industrialization going on in Ireland. There's serious industrialization at the end of the 18th century that the Act of Union with Britain kind of undercuts and does kind of force Ireland back into being more agricultural and a supplier of raw materials. They want to kind of imagine it as a rural space that is becoming industrial, and that is kind of, because then they can think through these problems. In the same way that Marx, or that Engels kind of accepts all of these ideas about Irish workers are kind of savage and they're pulling down the living standards of British workers, that becomes a way to kind of think through what is the problem within, like the working class is not this unified group of people. There are competing interests and there are competing groups. So they accept the idea that Ireland is just this kind of pastoral place, so as to think about this problem, I think, of how does a place that's not capitalist become capitalist, or kind of get incorporated into the global economy, and capitalist labor, land ownership can be created. Some of the Gaelic League people are just very straight ahead. This is a wonderful place. Everyone should go there, and you'll experience this kind of. This is the original Ireland. It's implicitly Catholic. It's all Irish speaking. It's pastoral and rural, and it's. I mean, even the quote I think I said at one point of their organs of speech have never been defiled. Like English is like a pollution it's like a poison in your mouth, and they've never had that. So someone like Desmond Ryan that I quoted, he's only like 16 or 17 when he writes this letter, completely exaggerates how wonderful these places are. You get, I think, a more interesting group of people then saying, this place should be wonderful, but it's not. It's just really backward. So there's a man called Patrick Deneen who writes the first Irish language dictionary, who travels through all this region just kind of as a lexicographer and anthropologist, like studying this language and writing it down. Owen McNeill, who later is the first Minister for Education and is also a professor at UCD, University College Dublin, he goes through this region as well, kind of traveling, learning the language. They'll constantly say it's a wonderful place, and yet it's an awful place at the same time. Like, it should be a wonderful place, and we need to make it live up to the symbolism that we have invested in it. And then you get someone like J.M. Singh, who is kind of part of this cultural tradition also of going out and living there. And I presume as an English PhD, you have read this book, but he says...
I've read this one. I've read
okay.
Yates. Yeah. But I'm familiar with it because it's quoted a lot.
So most of what he says is if you go there, all these people are living on remittances that they receive from their family that have moved to the US. They all have phonographs. Like he's much more interested in the actual reality of this is not some kind of pastoral little. These people are all integrated into global culture and the global economy. And he uses it to kind of almost destabilize, sort of like how Joyce does too, of, there's all these ideas floating around about how wonderfully unique Ireland is. It's not that unique at all. It's kind of cross-cut by all these other transnational currents. And the idea of the nation is itself really problematic. So that's kind of that's my general answer to that.
I know we're almost out of time. Do you have one new question? Yeah, go ahead.
My question is, I know Irish Gaelic it's kind of really hard to find direct translations and stuff.
Yeah.
How do you think if the bourgeois sea effect wouldn't have hit Ireland so hard as it did?
Yeah.
How do you think it would affect Irish Gaelic still?
As someone who's currently reading the first Game of Thrones novel in Irish, it's not that hard to find. It's a very thriving language today because it's heavily supported by the government. It's a language that the biggest problem is that no one wants to keep learning it. Or no one wants to in the 19th century wants to teach it to their children. Because you get, say in 1841, the population of Ireland was 8 million. In 1851, it was 4 million. So 2 million people die or so, maybe 1 million to 2 million die in the famine, and 2 to 3 million emigrate in the space of 10 years. Irish is an utterly useless language if you're going to the US. English is the language you need, so Irish speakers themselves are actually encouraging their children to go and learn English. if you kind of ask a lot of Irish people today, like, why did Irish disappear? They'll say, like, English schools came and the English government like forced children to learn English. And the reality is much less kind of nationalist. It's that Irish people themselves chose to stop to give up this language because it just wasn't really useful. Even the people who are kind of going from Dublin to these kind of rural regions, they'll say, like, sometime we're going to make this a language that will come back and everyone will speak it. And they never really mean that. That's just kind of rhetoric. Because what would that have actually done to Ireland's, I mean, even after Ireland became independent, it stayed dependent economically on Britain. Something like 90% of all Irish exports go to Britain in the 1920s after independence. So how do you actually trade with Britain if no one speaks English anymore? So Irish becomes almost like going to these regions, learning some of the language and kind of experiencing this culture is more important than actually making it a functioning vernacular language for the entire island. It stays a kind of a pastime rather than a big project where they're going to make everyone speak this language. I don't know if that really answers. Yeah, okay.
And it cycles back to Jason's original query too, because this issue exists today at a very different scale with language revival movements among Native American cultures. There's a lot of efforts being made, not with the kind of government funding that you have in Ireland, to kind of reclaim these dying languages.
The guidebook was written in English, though, right?
Yeah, and that's
That was the first thing I noticed about
Yeah, you have to convert them somehow.
You gotta convert them somehow.
So I'll say two things. One is you have like the last phrase here. You put the cover in Irish, right? But then the whole thing's in English. You'll also find Irish politicians who'll start off giving a speech in Irish, and then they'll say, and now I have to speak in English because all of you can't understand me. But really, it's a kind of a get out of jail free card of like, I also can't continue this speech in Irish because I don't know enough.
The paragraph.
Yeah. So you learn kind of the opening phrases of a speech, and then, yeah.
Two questions. One is about the Gaelic League, and I would like to understand better who they were, who they are. Is it? It's not clear to me if it's like an elite, like upper class people that has this dream of a primitivism that is very, elitarian in a way, and so it's very distinguished in a way from the first part of your talk that was related to Marx and Engels. So who were they?
They're generally like fairly middle class, like in the European sense of like doctors, lawyers.
Dublin.
Yeah. So they
also in the place. There were people that were maybe in Connemara or in Galway that were involved, or is it just an external thing that let's go all to this primitive, wonderful land?
It is definitely at the start dominated by people like that. I mean, Douglas Hyde lives in Dublin. Una ní Haralig lived in Dublin. I mean, they're a Dublin-based economic elite. They do set up branches all over the country, and it becomes a huge mass movement.
It's still active now.
It's still active now. In Corktown and Detroit, there's a Gaelic League club.
Yeah, I saw it now.
You have to be buzzed in, and they're a bit suspicious of outsiders. But so it becomes this huge mass movement, and that does change it then by the, say, 1910s. It gets taken over by very militant nationalists who force out Douglas Hyde as president. And it starts to become a lot more kind of elitist. Like this is from August 12th, 1914, so right at the start of sort of World War I is just looming, and they had this article about like Ireland and the war, and they say like it's Noirach and I can't quite read it, but like it is shameful that, I presume I know what the rest of it is, it's shameful that Irish people are about to go and fight for Britain, and it becomes much more militantly nationalistic. By the 1920s it becomes a kind of I wouldn't be surprised if they're often under police surveillance, because it stays militantly nationalist after independence, and it's sort of pushing for like full unified Irish independence from Britain rather than Dominion status. It still exists today, and now it's just sort of if you want, they just run classes and they're not
It's
really political.
surprising to me with the incredibly strong motivation of unifying a nation, and with such a strong common enemy, that the language didn't succeed in spread over. It's completely different situation, but I'm actually thinking to the Basque situation, or even to Israel, right?
Yeah.
In which people from this was much harder, if you want. To actually recreate something. It was just incredible, and so the motivation was very strong, but for some reason the language didn't survive.
Because I don't think,
much less than Sardinian in my land that has much less strong motivation. So I'm really curious about what made the thing.
Partly that I think the motivation was not to actually turn it into a vernacular language, and in some ways, like Hebrew faces a different situation, and sort of Zionists have this different situation where you have people moving out of Eastern Europe from the 1880s to 1914. Something like 4.5 to 5 million Jews emigrate, mostly going to the US or to England, to Argentina, to South Africa. So effectively you have, at that point, the largest ever mass migration in Jewish history, and a huge language shift as a result of that. And Zionism just kind of rides that wave and says, instead of going to America and learning English, go to Palestine and learn Hebrew. Having said that, up until the 1930s, the common language of Zionism was German.
Right.
All Zionist national congresses were held in German. And for obvious reasons, German becomes problematic from a Zionist perspective, from any kind of Jewish perspective in the 1930s. There's no other alternative then. You can't go to Yiddish because they absolutely despise that as a language. There is Arabic, which is spoken by hundreds of thousands of Middle Eastern Jews, but there are political problems with that, obviously, also as the Israel-Palestine conflict starts.
We can actually can't actually trace a common factors.
No.
Because, for example, Basque language, survived in a strongly dynamic and problematic situation, and now they are more peaceful. But still, language was a very strong instrument, right?
Yeah.
Kurdish is the other one.
Right. So we do have these realities.
Yeah.
Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But just my last question is about mostly related to. I found the attitude by Engels pretty much contradicted. It's very weird to me to what I know, and I don't know very much. But what I see is in real socialism. You have this situation in which men and women dress the same. There is the socialism. It's an international movement that make every single person in the world the same. So it's very contradictory.
Yeah.
They're 19th century thinkers, and they can't transcend their 19th century context.
Let's say it's surprising to me to apply racial values to peasants or to workers in Ireland if you are actually the person that is writing history in making everybody the same.
Read the Bolsheviks on the Jews.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and Marx on the Jewish question is a really interesting thing where he says,
the Bolsheviks hates the Jews and half of them are Jewish.
and he says, like, I'm really, he is, I think Marx is really disturbed by the idea of particularism. He doesn't like people that are different. He wants everyone to be the same.
But he falls into them.
And yet, there's something about the Irish that, like, they're different in a good way, because he sees them as radical. They're politically useful. He says that Ireland is the lever that where you need to apply force that will topple the entire British Empire, for completely wrong reasons. I mean, he completely overstates the importance of Ireland to the British economy.
But there is race involved.
I think,
or not.
the only possible explanation I can come up with is, why does he say Russia and Ireland it's okay, but everywhere else you shouldn't have national identity, and them being unprivatized is a problem? It's because they're white. He does not see Indians as white, South Asians as white, does not see says terrible things about Chinese people and says they're just kind of stagnant, and says, really horrific things about Jewish people, because I don't think he sees them as part of like a motivating active force in history. He does see the Irish as being a force in history. And I think it's impossible, I think, to answer that without saying it's because of race. Because he sees them as racially
Never
good, not
says
racially bad.
explicitly. So people are the same, or not? Or is it just the condition
No,
of Chinese
I don't think in
people?
Marx. I don't think that people are the same in Marx. I mean, I think that there's that was the question I was talking about earlier, and you mentioned earlier that like Marx does still believe in races.
Yeah.
That's sort of these sort of like types of
But they're
typology.
being homogenized.
Yeah.
Absolutely, they're
They're
homogenized
the
by
deep
capital.
consciousness, the deep traditions of the past that are being commodified, that are being homogenized by capitalist processes.
Yeah.
We need to let these students go.
Yeah.
Let's thank
Yeah.
Dr. Bailey.
Thank you.
Very
Thank you.
good.